Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 95th deck and it's titled Step Escapades. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a Commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. Now, really quickly before we get into things, I do want to apologize if my voice sounds a little bit scratchy. I am a little bit under the weather, so my voice is not quite up to par, but I feel confident I can get through this, so hopefully it doesn't detract too much. And then, of course, one last thing we got to do before we get into the actual deck tech itself, and that is to very quickly highlight some ways that you could help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So first off, we have Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, and email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of these are great ways to reach out if you ever have any questions, you want to talk about some decks, you want to suggest any decks or any cards that you would like to see turned into decks. All of these are great ways to do that. And then, of course, if you're looking to support the channel a little bit more directly, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video below. Any cards you purchase after clicking on that link just lets TCG Player know that we sent you over there, so they give us a little bit of support. And finally, the most direct way that you can help support this channel is through Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Anything over there really does help out quite a bit, but you get access to a ton of great stuff in return. You get access to the deck lists an entire week early. You get access to a Discord channel where you can participate in brewing up some of the decks as well as actually participating in some games. So if you wanted to be in some games on the channel, that's a great way to do it. You also get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And then finally, we'll also make sure that you get access to the unedited gameplay videos so you can hear the players talking and laughing with each other rather than just my own commentary. So if that is something you're interested in, and I almost forgot, one last big important thing for the Patreon. If you want to guarantee that any of your cards that you suggest get turned into videos for this channel, the only way to do that is through Patreon. I am, of course, happy to take suggestions otherwise, and I will do my best to turn those into videos, but the only way I can 100% guarantee it is if you sign up for the Patreon. So to our 4 current patrons, we have William Swiftfoot, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, and Doodle. So to the 4 of you, thank you all so much. But I suppose with all of my rambling out of the way, let's get into the actual deck tech. So first up, we got to talk about the random card of the week, and this one was suggested to us by Scarrien over on Reddit. And this card is a little bit unique, but we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. It is Doomed Artisan. So Doomed Artisan is 2 and a white for a 1/1 human artificer. Sculptures you control can't attack or block. And at the beginning of your end step, create a colorless sculpture artifact creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of sculptures you control. So overall, this is kind of a weird card because it wants us to make a ton of sculptures, but we can really only make 1 each turn, and they can't actually attack or block. Now, notably, if we remove Doomed Artisan, then the sculptures can attack and block, so they're not super useful until the Doomed Artisan is gone, which is a very strange ability, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with this. I looked up a ton of things that had to do with tokens. I looked at a bunch of different things about attacking and blocking, or maybe getting rid of our own creatures, and none of it really appealed to me. So instead, we are going to focus on the fact that this ability triggers on the end step. And so to go along with that, we needed a commander that's going to do the exact same thing while also adding some colors in there. And so we're going to add green, and we're going to play Gluntch the Bestower, which is 1 green-white for a 0/5 jellyfish. It has flying, and at the beginning of your end step, choose a player. They put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control. Choose a second player to draw a card. Then choose a third player to create 2 treasure tokens. If you notice, again, Gluntch triggers at the beginning of your end step. So we are really focusing on just building up a ton of triggers at the beginning of our, end step, and then making sure that we are going to outvalue our opponents by making sure that we have just so many different triggers and counters and whatever's happening at the end of turn. So Obviously, when we get into our themes, that is going to be our first theme. We're going to talk about the end step, making sure that we have abilities to trigger, and a great representation of that is something like Solemn Recruit. Solemn Recruit is 1 white for a 2/2 dwarf warrior. She's got Double Strike and Revolt. So at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Solemn Recruit. There's a good chance we'll be having permanents leave the battlefield every single turn because we might be blinking things, we might be attacking with things, we might just be removing things. So Solemn Recruit probably going to get quite large by the end of the game. And it's just another trigger that we can throw in at the end of our turn to make sure that whatever's happening, we're getting some sort of value from it. Now, that's not going to be the only thing that we have to worry about in this deck because just having counters put on stuff isn't quite going to get us there. And we do have to play into some of the other aspects of Doomed Artisan as well. So that is why our second theme is going to revolve around tokens. Since Doomed Artisan makes tokens, and there's actually quite a few different cards and abilities and triggers that make tokens at the end of turn, we're playing cards like Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, which is 2 and a green for a 2/3 legendary creature, human elf druid, and it says tokens you control have tap, add a green, and it also has choose a background, but since we're not using Jaheira as a commander, that's not relevant for us. The really important thing is that our tokens can tap to make a green mana. Now, our tokens that are being created by Doomed Artisan that can't attack or block can now tap for a green mana, letting us use them for something else that's going on. And that can be incredibly important because there's a chance we're making a ton of those tokens, and honestly a ton of other tokens as well, so we want to make sure that we use them for more than just attacking and blocking. And now, that leads us to the final theme of the deck, and this one's a little bit different, but it's going to be incredibly important for the way the deck plays out, and that is going to be a group hug strategy. So we want to be making sure that we are getting things, but at the same time, we're also giving our opponents things. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive when we're making a ton of tokens and putting counters on things. But if you remember back to Gluntch, Gluntch makes us choose 3 different players for each of his abilities. We don't get the choice on that one. We have to give some things to our opponents, so we may as well lean into that group hug strategy and hope that our opponents kind of leave us alone because we're giving them so many, well, gifts. And so a great example of that is Secret Rendezvous, which is 1 white for a sorcery. You and target opponent each draw 3 cards. Now, I know this is a very controversial card. Some people really think it's good. Some people really think it's bad. I'm on the side that I think it's a very good card because what we're able to do is kind of make friends at the table. We can maybe Secret Rendezvous, have target opponent draw 3 cards. Maybe they don't have enough lands. Maybe they're running out of cards, so it's not that big of a deal. Or honestly, maybe they just have too many cards and it doesn't really matter. But either way, we're able to kind of pick and choose who we target with this to make sure that we get the best benefits out of it. We can also try to kind of trick our way into getting something like a board wipe, maybe telling an opponent that we'll let them draw cards if they're able to cast a board wipe or something like that. It's a very political card, and I think it plays well into the group hug strategy while still making sure that we are doing the things we need to be doing. So those are our 3 themes for this week, and the next thing we got to do is take a quick look at some key cards. And each of these cards is not necessarily a win condition, but it's a card that synergizes very well with the deck and works to get us toward our final game plan. So the first of our key cards is going to be Nil's Discipline Enforcer, and if you've watched this channel for a while, you might know that I am a big fan of Nil's. I absolutely love putting this in as many decks as I can because I think this ability is super sweet. But Nil's is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature human cleric. At the beginning of your end step, for each player, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature that player controls. Not super great, we're giving counters to our opponents, but it helps us play into the group hug strategy. But the most important thing is that it also says each creature with 1 or more counters on it can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless its controller pays X, where X is the number of counters on that creature. So if we put 1 counter on each opponent's creature, now they have to pay 1 mana to attack us with that creature. And it's very important to note that Nils doesn't care about the counters he puts on things. It's only counters on it. It doesn't say +1/+1 counters. It doesn't say that it's got to be a specific counter put on by Nils. It's any counter put on a permanent. So if our opponent is playing something like, we'll say, Skullbriar, that has, 7 different ability counters on it, and it's got like a charge counter on it, and it's got some +1/+1 counters on it, they have to pay for every single one of those counters. So naturally, throughout the course of the game, counters kind of just start floating around, and it gets very simple to just drop nils on the board, and now our opponents can't even pay to attack us because they have so many counters on their stuff. So nils alone is very good, but just with the amount of cards that put counters on things, nils gets even better, especially when we just, we don't want to be attacked. So that is key card number 1. Key card number 2 is going to look a little bit different. That is going to be your temple is under attack. So now we're going from not wanting to be attacked to our temple is straight up under attack. And the reason that this is going to be so good for us is because it has multiple options. So your temple is under attack is 2 and a white for an instant that says choose one. We can either pray for protection and creatures we control gain indestructible until end of turn, or strike a deal. You and target opponent each draw 2 cards. These are both very relevant texts because now we have the group hug strategies. We can make sure that we are helping someone else draw cards. We are drawing cards if we need it. We're making a friend at the table. But we're also going to be able to give our creatures indestructible at instant speed. So if someone tries to board wipe and we have a ton of tokens and a ton of creatures on board, maybe we've got Nils and Gluntch and whatever, we can cast Your Temple is Under Attack to give everything indestructible so that we survive the board wipe, but nobody else does. So this is an incredibly flexible card that really just... there's no text on it that's bad. Everything it does is exactly what we want, so it's nice to be able to have that choice on just a random card that we're playing. And then our final key card is going to be Paradox Zone. So Paradox Zone is going to be 4 and a green for an enchantment that enters the battlefield with a growth counter on it, and at the beginning of your end step, double the number of growth counters on Paradox Zone, then create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of growth counters on Paradox Zone. So originally this isn't going to be super helpful. We'll make a 1/1 at the end of our turn, then next turn we make a 2/2, but eventually we start making a 4/4, then an 8/8, and a 16/16, a 32/32. This can get out of hand very, very quickly, especially because we're a green deck. We have the ability to ramp, we have the ability to protect our things, we have the ability to make sure that our opponents can't attack us. So Paradox Zone, while it doesn't seem very strong up front, if it's able to stick around for just a couple of turns, it's going to start churning out massive, massive creatures. And Paradox Zone triggering at our end step means that we can kind of tack on a bunch of other abilities, like Nils for example, to make sure that there's always something happening and our opponents probably won't know what exactly should be destroyed because they're all going to kind of be a problem. But those are our 3 key cards for this deck, and the next thing that I want to do is take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that synergize very well together and kind of help us create some very fun moments, but also some very powerful moments in some games. So the first of these 2 cool interactions we're going to take a look at is going to be between Dawnbreak Reclaimer and Scavenger Grounds. Now, it's not often we put lands on the cool interaction section, so you know it's going to be pretty interesting. But we'll start with Scavenger Grounds, and that is the land. It's a desert, it taps to add a colorless, and you can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice a desert, and exile all cards from all graveyards. Then, if we can combine that with Dawnbreak Reclaimer, which is 4 white for a 5/5 flying angel, at the beginning of your end step, choose a creature card in an opponent's graveyard, then that player chooses a creature card in your graveyard, you may return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. The nice thing here is that we can control when Scavenger Grounds is used. So we can wipe away all the cards in the graveyards and then put some more cards into our graveyard. This will help make sure that when we use Dawnbreak Reclaimer's ability, we will have a creature in our graveyard, but our opponents won't, or at least one of our opponents won't. Because the nice thing about Dawnbreak Reclaimer is that if we have a creature in our graveyard and an opponent doesn't, the ability still happens. We just don't choose a creature for our opponent since there's no legal target, but they still have to choose a creature from our graveyard, and then we get to put them back into play. So we can just, for free, reanimate something every single turn and make sure that our opponents aren't getting the same thing because they might not have any creatures in their graveyard considering we just exiled them all. Now, we can also use this in a reverse way and actually give our opponents things, but that plays more into the group hug strategy, and it's kind of up to you and what you want to do. I just thought this was something to at least highlight in the deck. And then that's going to lead us into our second cool interaction, which is going to be between Rabble-Rousing and Halo Fountain. Now, the interaction between these two probably isn't a secret, considering they both came from the same set in Streets of New Capenna, but it's still important to take a look at. So first up, Rabble-Rousing is 4 and a white for an enchantment. It has Hideaway 5, so when it enters the battlefield, we look at the top 5 cards of our library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Then, whenever we attack with 1 or more creatures, which we should have a ton because we're a token deck, create that many 1/1 green and white citizen creature tokens. Then if you control 10 or more creatures, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Now, I feel like this card goes underrepresented quite a bit because it is incredibly easy to get to that 10 creature mark. All you have to do is cast Rabble-Rousing and then attack with 5 creatures, and you've already got the 10. Because it's going to immediately double your 5 into 10. And if they all happen to live, then all of a sudden you're turning your 10 into 20, and your 20 into 40. So Rabble-Rousing gets out of hand very, very quickly. And so we're going to combine that up with Halo Fountain, which is 2 and a white for an artifact. It has white, tap, untap a tapped creature you control, create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token, 2 white, tap, untap 2 tapped creatures you control, draw a card, and 5 white, tap, untap 15 tapped creatures you control, you win the game. So Rabble-Rousing can go from 5 tokens to 10 tokens to 20 tokens in just 2 turns. At that point, Halo Fountain's final ability to win the game is now online because we're able to attack with all of those tokens, untap 15 of them, and just win. The other thing that we can do is if Rabble-Rousing isn't making us the full 15, we're just making, maybe 3, maybe 4, we can still use it to untap those tokens, make sure that they can block, and then either make more tokens or draw cards. So Halo Fountain is really just a huge value engine once we get going, because we really do want to try to be attacking every turn with our creatures. So if we can untap them to make sure they can block while also getting some form of value out of it, that's exactly what we want to be doing. And I think that's why these two work just so well together. But that is the last of our cool interactions. So the next thing we've got to do for our deck tech is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the price comes out to $66.20, and that is mostly because of one specific card, which is Wedding Announcement. Wedding Announcement is 2 and a white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. Then, if you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card. We'll probably do that. We got tokens. Otherwise, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Then, if Wedding Announcement has 3 or more invitation counters on it, transform it. And when it transforms, it turns into Wedding Festivity, which is an enchantment that gives creatures you control +1/+1. So this is a great way to draw cards, great way to create tokens, and a great way to pump up our tokens once we flip it. So Wedding Announcement really does everything we're trying to do. It is unfortunately over $8, so if you do need to cut it to drop the price down closer to about 58, I think is the math there, then this is definitely the card to cut because it is very expensive, and it's mostly expensive because it sees a lot of play in formats like Pioneer and Standard, so not usually too powerful in Commander because you've got to wait 3 turns to even flip it, but it's at least worth a shot in this deck because, like I said, it does everything we want to do. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to increase the price of the deck with some cards that wouldn't normally fit into the budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So the only card that I would recommend including that wouldn't normally be in the budget for this deck is going to be Wedding Ring. And Wedding Ring is 2 white for an artifact. When Wedding Ring enters the battlefield, if it was cast, target opponent creates a copy that's a copy of it. Whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring draws a card during their turn, you draw a card. Whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains life during their turn, you gain that much life. So we are able to really take advantage of this because of some of our group hug strategies. Because we have instant speed card draw effects for our opponents. We have ways of gaining life at instant speed for our opponents. By being able to take advantage of that, we can give it to the person, say, to our right, and then at the end of their turn, cast something like Your Temple is Under Attack, we draw 2 cards, they draw 2 cards. Then, since they drew 2 cards on their turn, we also now draw an additional 2 cards. So there are some tremendous ways to take advantage of Wedding Ring in a multiplayer format, especially considering we're a group hug style deck. But on the other side, the card that I would recommend to take out of this deck to replace it is Nightpack Ambusher, which is the same mana cost, just different colors, 2 green for a 4/4. It's a creature, wolf, it's got flash. Other wolves and werewolves you control get +1/+1, and at the beginning of your end step, if you didn't cast a spell this turn, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. Now, I know I just talked about all the ways that we could interact with Wedding Ring at instant speed, but for the most part, we don't want to be doing everything on our opponent's turn. It would be really nice to be able to play some things on our turn and then activate abilities on our opponent's turn, and Nightpack Ambusher doesn't really play into that. We don't have a ton of flash. We do have some instants, but not a ton. We're not built around it. So I don't think Nightpack Ambusher is as good in this deck as I would like it to be, especially because it's really only in here for the end step trigger. But if we can't trigger the end step trigger, then it's like it doesn't have it at all, and at that point, there's no reason to have it. So while Nightpack Ambusher is a very good card, I don't quite think this is the deck for it, so if you have the ability to swap it out for Wedding Ring, that would be my suggestion. And now, finally, we move to the very last piece of this deck tech, which is to see how the deck actually performs in a game. Because I can talk about it all I want, but unless we see it in action, it does not really going to make too much sense. So, we are going to run up against 3 opponents today. First up, we have Jason playing Obun Moldiah Ancestor. We have Bilal playing Vile Smasher the Fierce and Thrasios Triton Hero. And we have Shawn playing Go-Shintai of Life's Origin. So starting off with Jason and his Obun deck, this is a lands matter deck, so he wants to play as many lands as possible, turn them into giant creatures thanks to his commander, and just kind of start knocking people out with giant elemental lands. I don't think that this is going to be too much of an issue for us. I think the only thing that's going to become a problem is that the lands trample, and we can only throw so many tokens underneath a trampling land before they start to kind of just overpower us, so I think that is a concern, but we'll see how it goes. Next up, we have Bilal's Vile Smasher and Thrasios deck, and this is just kind of a 4-color good stuff pile. He really wants to just kind of combo off, do some crazy things really quickly. So I think out of the 3 opponents, this is the one that I'm the most concerned about. Less so for Vile Smasher. While Vile Smasher is a very powerful card, Thrasios is the engine here because it allows Bilal to somehow make infinite mana and then just kind of go through his deck. Vile Smasher is just going to be a small damage outlet once in a while. I don't anticipate him being a problem. I think he's really just here for the colors, but we'll see how that one goes. And then finally, we have Shawn and his Go-Shintai deck, and this is a 5-color shrine deck, and it's exactly what it sounds like. He's playing all the shrines, trying to get as much value from them as possible, but because all the shrines are also going to be enchantments, he is also an enchantress deck, so he wants to play the cards that gain him life for playing enchantments and draw him cards for gaining enchantments and all of that fun stuff. Now, I've seen Go-Shintai go off before, so I know it's a very powerful deck, but I'm hoping that we can kind of outvalue the shrines by just playing a ton of end step triggers and a bunch of tokens and things like that. So we will see how it goes. Hopefully you all enjoy the game. Hopefully you liked the deck tech. If you did, please do like and subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Bilal, myself, and then Shawn. On Jason's first turn, he plays a Wooded Foothills, sacrificing it to search his library for a Jetmir's Garden, putting it into play tapped. Bilal plays a Swamp, and then casts Viscera Seer, letting him sacrifice a creature to scry 1. I play a Desert of the Indomitable. Shawn plays an Opulent Palace. Jason plays a Forest and casts Soul Ring. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. I play a Plains and cast Sakura Tribe Elder. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Weaver of Harmony, giving his other enchantment creatures +1/+1 and letting him activate it to double an ability from an enchantment. In response, Jason casts Roiling Regrowth, sacrificing a forest to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Also in response, I sacrifice my Sakura Tribe Elder to search my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. On Jason's turn, he casts Trove Warden, letting him exile a permanent mana value 3 or less from his graveyard whenever he plays a land, and then putting everything exiled into play when it leaves the battlefield. He then plays a Crag Crown Pathway, exiling Wooded Foothills from his graveyard. Bilal plays Xander's Lounge and casts Yahenni Undying Partisan, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent's creature dies, and can sacrifice a creature to gain indestructible until the end of turn. I play a Plains and cast my commander Gluntch the Bestower, and then immediately move to my end step, triggering Gluntch, giving myself 2 treasure tokens, letting Jason draw a card, and letting Bilal put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature he controls. Shawn plays a Forest and casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. Jason casts his commander Obun Moldiah Ancestor, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature whenever he plays a land, and also, when he goes to combat, turns his lands into an XX elemental creature, where X is Obun's power. He then plays a Forest, putting a counter on Obun, exiling a Forest from his graveyard, and moves to combat, turning his new Forest into a 4/4 elemental. He then attacks Shawn for 4 with the land, and me for 3 with the Warden. I block, taking no damage, while Shawn takes the 4. Bilal plays a Rockfall Veil and casts his commander Vile Smasher the Fierce, doing damage equal to the mana value of the first spell he casts each turn to a random opponent. I play a Forest and cast Dawnbreak Reclaimer, letting me choose an opponent in my end step, and then we both choose a creature card in each other's graveyards to return to the battlefield. Then in my end step, I choose Jason, who has no creatures to return to play, while he chooses my Sakura Tribe Elder. Gluntch also triggers, giving me 2 counters, letting Shawn draw a card, and letting Jason put 2 +1/+1 counters on one of his creatures. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Forest and casts Sithis Harvest Hand, letting him draw a card and gain a life whenever he casts an enchantment. He also casts Go-Shintai of Ancient Wars, drawing a card, gaining a life, and being able to pay 1 mana in his end step to do X damage to target player or planeswalker, where X is the number of shrines he controls. Jason plays a Kessig Wolfrun, putting a counter on Obun, and then moves to combat, turning one of his forests into a 7/7 elemental, using it to attack me for 7 and also attacking Shawn for 7 with Obun. Bilal plays an island and casts his other commander, Thrasios Triton Hero, which can be activated for 4 mana to scry 1, then reveal the top card of his library, putting it into play if it's a land, and drawing it if it's not. This also triggers Vile Smasher, doing 2 damage randomly to Shawn. At the end of turn, I sacrifice Sakura Tribe Elder, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play, and also putting a 1/1 counter on Yahenni. Then on my turn, I play a Canopy Vista, and attack Bilal for 5 with my Angel, and Shawn for 0 with Gluntch. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Hornet Queen, creating 4 1/1 insect tokens with Flying and Death Touch. I also cast Wedding Announcement, drawing a card at the end of turn since I attacked with 2 or more creatures. Finally, in my end step, I return Sakura Tribe Elder from my graveyard to play, while Shawn, unfortunately, has no creatures to return, and then I draw a card, let Bilal make 2 treasures, and let Shawn put 2 +1/+1 counters on one of his creatures. In Shawn's upkeep, I sacrifice Sakura Tribe Elder, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play, and putting a 1/1 counter on Yahenni. Then Shawn plays a Swamp and casts his commander Go-Shintai of Life's Origin, letting him make a 1/1 shrine token whenever Go-Shintai or another non-token shrine enters under his control, also drawing him a card and gaining a life. He then casts a Felwar Stone, and at the end of turn, pays 1 for Ancient Wars, doing 3 damage to Jason since he controls 3 shrines. Still at the end of turn, Jason casts Return of the Wild Speaker, drawing 7 cards since he controls a creature with 7 power. On Jason's turn, he casts Retreat to Kazandu, letting him gain 2 life or put a counter on a creature whenever land enters under his control. He then plays a Plains, putting 2 counters on Obun, and also casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into his hand, the other into play, and putting 2 more counters on Obun. He then casts Azusa Lost But Seeking, letting him play 2 more lands each turn. This lets him play a Forest and a Mountain, putting 4 more counters on Obun. He then moves to combat, turning a mountain into a 14/14 elemental, attacking Bilal for 14 with the land, and Shawn for 14 with Obun. Shawn blocks with his shrine token, killing it, but taking no damage, while Bilal takes the full 14. Then at the end of turn, Bilal activates Thrasios' ability, scrying 1 and then drawing a card. Still at the end of turn, Bilal casts Worldly Tutor, searching his library for a creature, in this case Protean Hulk, putting it on top of his library so he can draw it for turn. Once he casts the Hulk on his turn, he's able to sacrifice it to search his library for any number of creatures, total power 6 or less, putting them into play. This winds up getting him Murderous Redcap and Malira Sylvok Outcast, which, when combined, allow him to do 2 damage to any target with the Redcap, sacrificing it and returning it to play an infinite number of times thanks to Malira, doing an infinite amount of damage to each opponent, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a very short game. We actually wrapped it up on turn 6 for this one, but I think it was nice to see everyone's deck really kind of get to do their thing. We made a ton of tokens and had a ton of triggers. We actually sacrificed Sakura Tribe Elder 3 times in this game, all thanks to our angel that was bringing stuff back out of the graveyard. So it was super sweet, and I actually had a ton of fun playing the Gluntch deck. It's a deck that, while I don't keep decks around from decks that I build for the channel very often, I might keep this one around in paper just because I had so much fun with it. Shawn and his shrines also did very good. He didn't quite get the build-up he wanted, but he had the setup going, and I think that if he had had just a couple more turns to cast some shrines, he kind of would have gotten out of hand very, very quickly because he was going to be making shrines every single turn and activating their abilities and drawing cards and gaining life, and it was just going to slowly spiral out of control if he just had a little bit more time. Jason and his lands deck really was the threat from the get-go. He was swinging as early as turn 4 with just massive 4/4 lands, and then they kept getting bigger and bigger, and he kept finding ways to make more land drops and put counters on Obun. So it was overall very impressive showing from the Obun deck, and his deck is another one that I think if he had been given just a couple more turns, he might have been able to make his lands so big that they couldn't really be stopped. So not quite his game, unfortunately, though, because Bilal, while he looked pretty unassuming for the most part of the game, he played a couple of sacrifice outlets, but he didn't really attack anybody. He, honestly, it's going to sound bad, but he didn't really do anything until he was able to tutor for the Protean Hulk to sacrifice it and find an infinite combo. So a kind of unfortunate way for it to end because the rest of us were not expecting it. Nobody was holding up any interaction removal, anything like that. So none of us had a way to interact with what was going on, but a very impressive win. And it really just goes to show the power of Protean Hulk, because I don't think I've ever seen anyone cast a Protean Hulk and lose the game. So very sweet showing by all players and by all decks. So hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.